In theory, it's a serious survey, but only 50%. I found it very, very interesting. Here we had probably around less than 50%, I guess. Okay, I didn't count properly, but I think it was less than 50%. Anyway, the thing is, a lot of people have this in mind. Why I have to worry about my privacy if I don't have anything to hide? And I heard that a number of times when I'm working with people. Why I work a lot with healthcare, okay? Mainly my area of work is with NHS. And I receive also, as part of my work, complaints for patients that they want their records smoothly transferred from one doctor to another doctor, from England to Scotland, and they don't understand all these barriers, transferring data and things like that. And sometimes they say, I have nothing to hide. I want my records there for my care. But you know, as you know, it goes beyond that. Now, from your view, I mean, I understand that you know that this is a human right. I'm not going to read that for you because you know that. But that's the main reason what we are talking about here. This is why people need a little bit of consideration about privacy. How many of you are in that position where if you have to choose between your privacy or, for example, your health care, and you have to decide if you want to expose your information or have less security in the event that you have to have less security in order to protect your health? What goes first for you in your balance, health or privacy? Is your health. And I think that's the situation. Is that fair for the individuals? No, it's not fair that we are saying if you want to receive care, you have to compromise your privacy, right? One of the patient rights, which is in the charter, is the right to privacy. It is a human right, as we said. And the work what we do is along national projects to ensure that not just software developers, but everybody implementing a digital solution, that they have into consideration the privacy of the individuals, fairness first, and compliance with GDPR, but also the risk for the organization, okay? Now, for those that think that you are fine because you have nothing to hide, here we go. We all have something to hide, and we all have something that we don't want others to know. I don't want to see my picture like that on internet, okay? When you think about privacy, are you mostly software developers, by the way? That's my understanding, yeah? Or you are in that area, yeah? When you think about privacy, what sort of rights come to your mind? Because you have to design software that complies with those rights. So what are you talking about? What comes to your mind? What you have to protect here? The right to be forgotten?
You want to make sure that your information is not just randomly available to other third parties. You know who has your information, not just anybody.
Exactly. So access control. You want to know. You want to know what happens with your data and who has access to your data, yeah? That's what you are saying?
Right. Yeah, I don't want someone to be able to sell my information or just an exposed website with my information on it.
Exactly. So at some point you have the right, you think you have the right that your data is treated properly and the right to know what people are doing with your data, yeah? What other things we have? You are cheating. You work in GDPR. Come on. Yeah, exactly. What I want to bring to your attention is when we talk about privacy, one thing is what the human rights says, what privacy is. That was this picture, this here, okay? But the other thing is, in practical terms, what are the rights from the data protection perspective that when we design software or when we handle data, we have to keep in mind. And these are the rights that we have to protect in our design. The right to be informed, someone here said that. The right of access, if you want to access to your data, you can ask for that. The access to rectification, erasure, restrict processing, data portability that you mentioned there, the right to object to the processing, and the right to understand that your data cannot be used just for automated decisions, purely automated decisions without human intervention, or profiling without a number of other controls, okay? Now, rectification. Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There is anything in there that any of these rights that you are not sure what does it mean? Yeah, it's related. Restriction of the processing can be a limitation. The objection can be not just for the processing, the objection can be for other things during the processing. Okay, so the restriction of processing is don't do that with my data. The objection can be applied to that as well, but can be objection to decisions made over the use of your data rather than the actual overall processing of your data. Okay, so it's much wider. But yeah, they are related. Okay. Anyway, these are your rights, and this is what we are going to talk about this today. Now, in order to ensure that we comply with these rights, we need to ensure that we have our digital technologies, so it's not just the software or the applications, but all the technology that we are using and the infrastructures that we are using, the processes, the environment, and the people that are handling the data do what they have to do and are unconscious about these rights. And I like to think about it as an ecosystem where we have a digital innovation that involves software, but we need to ensure that all the processes and and the people that are using the data understand by design how we thought the data was going to be used and protected, and they follow those rules. And if there are changes, the risk that can come from those changes is spotted, is discussed, is mitigated in terms of risks, and once the risk is accepted, people go on and do whatever, carry on with the processing. I mean, I'm not saying that we cannot change the thing that is the original design, but has to be in terms of understanding the risk that comes with that. Okay, so I tend to think about it in terms of an ecosystem more than just a set of instructions or controls that we put in an application. Okay. Now, this is Basque. See, a lot of information here that no one understands. Exactly. I'm not going to read this, okay? I'm torturing you with this slide. This is torture by design, okay? But what I wanted is that keep in mind, I think that you will have access somehow to these slides, or otherwise just check and Google it. Recital 75, why we have to do all these things. And actually, the law is telling us that we have to respect the rights and freedoms of natural people, that we have to prevent physical, material, or non-material damage to these people because, or as a consequence of using their private data, their personal data. They understand, the law understands privacy and data protection in terms of preventing discrimination, identity theft, fraud, financial loss, reputation, loss of confidentiality, and so forth. So I wanted to show you that actually the law is as specific as that. Okay, and when you are designing what you do with your data, you have to do risk analysis to ensure that the risk of these things is minimal. Okay, and now we are going to see how we're going to do that later on in a way that is reasonable. Okay, what data anyway are we talking about? Because you develop software that do many things and use a lot of data. Okay, what data actually are we talking about here? Well, in terms of GDPR and Data Protection Act, we are talking about someone, a person, a natural person that is a living individual that is calling the legislation data subjects, okay? And that person has information, and we handle information about that individual, information that relates to that individual, that is considered personal data because relates to that person. Okay? Now you cannot see that here, but there are in the slide. I promise you that there's some things there in red and some things in black. Health information, for example, sexual life, political opinions, and things like that. All this information is sensitive in the legislation. So there are types of information that you have to be particularly cautious when you use them, okay? And in particular, health information, sex life or sexual orientation, political opinions, religion, if you are trade union member or not, biometric data, genetic data. So all these are sensitive data, okay? And all we need to know is that the legislation also say that we have to be cautious, not just when we collect the data, on where we store the data, but also when we do anything with the data, because the law is about processing data. A number of times I had projects where people say, I want to do this and that, but actually my app is not storing any data. But you are collecting data, you are asking for data, and you are probably transferring data from A to B, even if you are not storing the data. That you are doing things with the data, therefore you are processing, okay? The other thing that you have to keep in mind, this slide is for you. Sorry, I forgot that one. I'm not going to read this. These ones that have a lot of text and are intentional, okay? These are by design, so you can see how boring can be reading GDPR, the legislation. But I try to extract some important words that determine the way we have to understand how are we going to design the way we work, okay? So from GDPR, you have to take into account this data that relates to individuals, living individuals, where these individuals have to live or reside to be under the legislation in the UK, okay, to comply with the GDPR. So it relates to UK residents, European residents. After Brexit, we will talk about UK residents, right? So you are dealing with this type of data, sensitive or not sensitive, but relates to an individual. What the law says is that you have to protect it, and the measures that you are going to use to protect your data have to be reasonable. And you have to take into account, and they say, the state of the art, the cost of the implementation of all the security measures that you have to put in place, okay? So the law says, the law doesn't say it has to be 100% safe, for an obvious reason, okay? What it says is that you have to take into account the environment and what is sensible to do, and you have to go ahead and implement what is sensible and appropriate, okay? And that's a big question. What is appropriate and what is not? So you have to do that, and you have to do that across the life cycle of the data. So this poor man is still saying, I just still don't understand what is privacy and design, so please tell me, because what is this about? So these are the type of risks that you are going to find. And privacy by design is about minimizing the risk that these things can happen. Some of them, probably you spotted already in one of the slides, because they are written by law, okay? Data lost, for example, identity theft and things like that. Some of them are already named in the legislation. But it doesn't matter if they are named or not. At the end of the day, if they can have an impact in the privacy of the individual, cause any significant damage to the individual, we have to relate that to a risk. So privacy by design is basically a systematic risk minimization process, okay? And we have obviously to start at the very early stages of the life cycle of the information throughout our innovation projects. Uh, as you already gathered, it goes before or beyond, a software, piece of software as a product. We mentioned the ecosystem, the information ecosystem. You have to take into account if you are developing an app, it's not just your app, it's what your app is going to use in the, this is about healthcare, but anyway, in the healthcare environment or the environment where you are going to use the app, you think it's going to be used. There are some arrows there, and apologies that in the slide you cannot see them. You have to think on how that app is going to use in the context, configure and use there. You have to consider the bodies that are there, okay? And how can you protect that from cyber attacks and other type of, not only cyber attacks, but any sort of attack. And you have to understand as well what is the infrastructure. I painted here a cloud, but I don't really mean only the cloud. It's about what is the infrastructure. You have to understand once the data leaves your device and goes somewhere else, what's happening with that. So you need to understand all that picture. And you need to design protection of privacy, meaning minimizing the risks that are there, okay? Thinking of the little boy there, that seems quite away from our design, but actually is our data subject, okay? And should be the core of our thoughts in this process. I wanted to bring to your attention this, although you know this, how difficult it is to think where my understanding these data flows, how my data is processed throughout all this data flow is very complicated because the systems that we design these days have so many interdependencies of other bits and pieces of technology. Some of them, we know roughly how they work and the risks that we are inheriting from those technologies, but some of them we don't know, we don't have that clear. You might be even reusing code that you are not 100% convinced or understand what that code is actually doing with the data. So the interdependencies these days are a great source of risk in terms of you understanding what is the risk that you are inheriting in your solution, okay? As I said, regardless how complex it is to understand that, is your responsibility. If you are in the healthcare sector and you are designing software that is considered a medical device, you are responsible for that medical device if you are creating the software. So if you are using other infrastructures or other technologies or other piece of code from other people, still, by integrating that in your solution, you become responsible when you sell that software as a medical device, okay? So you have to be mindful of that. So you have to design appropriate security. And we are satisfied that what is appropriate depends on what the law said before. I show you that terrible slide with lots of text there that says you need to keep in mind the context, okay? The state of the art and the context, and decide what is reasonable to expect that you do, okay? But you have to put your case there. If something goes wrong, you have to be able to defend your position, why you didn't apply some security measures, or why you did or why you didn't. You have to be able to explain that to the Information Commissioner officer in the event that something goes wrong, okay? But as long as you are satisfied that you are designing something that it would be really unreasonable to expect that you apply a particular security measure, or the risk for an individual is very, very low, that it doesn't make sense to invest millions of pounds in solving an issue that is a negligible risk, then it's fine. If you can defend that position, it's fine. But you have to understand where you are standing in terms of the risk of your application. And you do that through something that is called DPIA, which is a Data Protection Impact Assessment, okay? So a DPIA is a process, And basically, it's about, first of all, trying to understand what is the data flow in your application. As I said, sometimes it's very difficult to make a clean cut between software development and the rest of the aspects of the design and conception of how the system is going to use, okay? So you have to be a little bit flexible on that. But at the end of the day, it's about you and other people that work in your project. You have to understand the data flows. And you have to, and when I say is those that are obvious and those that are not that obvious, because you might be using technologies that send your data outside Europe, for example, or outside the UK, and you need to understand that that's happening, okay? So you need to understand those data flows as well as you can, okay? Then you need to determine what are the privacy risks. And I show you here a few of them, okay? These are a few of them, but there are more. So you have to be creative to try to identify what are the privacy risks that I've got in my solution. I have to be fair here. When I talk about privacy risks, I'm actually talking about data protection risks, which is more than privacy, okay? Because it's about the risk for your organization to fail complying with the law, okay? So that's not necessarily a privacy risk in itself, but it's a risk for your organization for not complying with data protection legislation. So it's privacy and whatever comes with a risk of no compliance with the data protection legislation. You have then to be creative, selecting controls to minimize the risk. And you have to reduce the risk to a level that is adequate. And as I said, your guide to say how much is enough are two things. One is that position where you think that if the use of your application puts into trouble some people in terms of privacy, how much you are able to defend your position or your decision of not including some controls, okay? If you are happy with explaining to the Information Commissioner Officer and the people that actually suffer the consequences, the outcome of your decision, then that's fine. If you are able and that you can do that. You have to find the reasons for that. Otherwise, you have to add further controls. And the other thing is you have to convince your organization at the end of the day, that's another word, the data controller, that it's cost this much time and effort and money to put these countermeasures in place. So they have to be happy with the risk, and you have to think what the ICO, the Information Commissioner Office, and the public, the data subject, is going to say in the event of a breach. And that should give you a guide about what is reasonable and what is not reasonable. So unfortunately, there are no better rules than that. The other thing, as I said, is you need to get acceptance of your risk. So you document your data protection impact assessment, and then you have to send that to some people for approval. And these are, I'm going to show you minimum. You need to have the senior information risk owner in your organization. And what is that? Well, that is the person in your organization that is going to suffer the fines of the Information Commissioner Officer if something happens, okay? So whoever that person is, you have to get the approval. And you might have also information asset owners who are, if you are talking about big projects with big innovations, you might have people that are triggering those innovations, and they take responsibility not for your solution, but the data in itself, okay? So you need to have the approval of people that are responsible for that data, that they are happy with the risk of using your solution, okay?
Personal responsibility or?
Organizational responsibility. Yeah, no, it's not personal responsibility, it's the organization, okay? And once you have done all that, obviously you have to carry on implementing those measures. And the other thing is communicating, and we are going to get back to that because part of the software development, we tend to think that ends when we develop the software, we have tested, we have released versions, and then we enter into cycles of maintenance and whatever, okay, improvements and so forth. However, in terms of data protection, you have to think that you have to document this data protection impact assessment as you start designing and developing your solution. But you also have to think that at the end, usually your software is going to be implemented somewhere, and that organization needs some guidance with regards to how it has to be used or implemented in order to ensure that the security is as it was designed. So it's about telling you, well, this is the way you should configure the solution. This is the way you should use this solution if you want to have the security that I'm telling you that my product has. Otherwise, you have to do your own assessments anyway, okay? So it's about notifying people how that should be done. So maybe your application, for example, has to have some sort of configuration that you recommend that is done in certain ways. Otherwise, it's not going to be as secure as you thought. Or your application is designed to work with role-based access. Your recommendation has to be that the organization that is adopting has to have role-based definitions in their house in order to adopt it and not just create one role for everybody, okay? So these sort of things, okay? And obviously, we have to monitor the performance and manage the risk regularly, okay? Because it's no solution or no data protection impact assessment finished once we have done it. It's a live document. The risks change all the time. As soon as we make changes in our software or the infrastructure or the way we use the software, we need to review the risks, okay? So we need to have that in mind and be mindful that it's a cycle. It's not just a one-off exercise. So in short, it's 4 steps. In order to make it in a practical way, what we recommend is that, first of all, be pragmatic. So assess what type of project are you talking about, okay? What is the profile of your project? Is a high-profile project or a low-profile project, okay? Based on that, you will decide how much documentation, how much security, or how much effort you are going to put in your data protection impact assessment, okay? For low-risk things, there's no point in spending time having a complicated process and a complicated set of documentation and hours of effort, okay? But when you are determining if it's a high profile or a low profile project, you have to consider the individual, okay? The impact for the individual, not just the millions of pounds that your project is investing, is in terms of privacy, okay? So this is one example, and I don't know if you use this terminology, but at the end of the day, you will understand. You would recommend that you use a triage tool. There are tools there for assessing what is the size or profile of your project, high impact, low impact project. In big questions like what is the volume of your investment, what is the impact of that project in a particular strategy that you might be running, or how much data are we talking about you are involved in a project of big data for the entire population in Scotland, or you are talking about a project that only a few users are going to use. So depending on that and the type of data, you determine the size of your project and the profile, the big numbers of the profile of your project, and you decide based on that. If it's high risk, then probably you want to complete what we call a super duper security documentation, specifying all the details about all the security controls that are in your solution, okay? If it's medium risk, we might have a lighter version of that documentation, and you reduce the hours and dedication of producing that documentation, but it still is good enough. If it's low risk, what we recommend is that, and this is something that we use across the NHS, but obviously you may have your own variations. We recommend that you speak to the security officer if you have one in your organization, or if it's a project that you are running for a client and the client has an information security officer, try to negotiate what is the level of information, security information that you want to document and be happy to share in order to understand the risk of your application. If it's low risk, there's no point documenting everything that your application or every single control that your application has, okay? Then you have to consider what is the security of the organization. And again, in healthcare, we have something that is called the, some people call it the third-party security questionnaire, but basically it's not enough understanding the security of a product. You also need to document what is the security of the organization or organizations that are involved in running the product or products, infrastructure and your product, okay? All the bits and pieces. So you might have subcontractors that you rely upon, some of the, because you are using the cloud or whatever. So you want to understand how much you can trust. Your organization has to be trusted, but also has to be trusted these other parties. This is what we call the organizational security questionnaire. Have you heard, I imagine, about the ISO 27001? So it's that kind of questions that this questionnaire is asking for. So it's not only about understanding your product, can be fantastic, but if your organization is not serious enough handling the security, then probably you are failing in a number of tick boxes of security, okay? So one of the, I don't know if you remember the WannaCry, has been mentioned a number of times. The WannaCry wasn't an issue in itself. The problem wasn't technical as much as organizational. So it was about organizations not having appropriate patching policies in place. Okay, so those are the questions that in this questionnaire you will assess, okay? Is the organization serious enough to handle all these things that need to happen properly, from staff to patch management, to change management, to many other things, okay? And with all that, you put all that together in a DPIA, or Data Protection Impact Assessment, okay? If you are not sure anyway, if you need one, we recommend that you follow the triage tool that is available through the Information Commissioner Office website. There is a model there that tells you when you need one and when you don't need one. But if your software is going to process data about a large number of individuals and is personal data, and particularly if it's sensitive, quite likely you need a DPIA to be documented, written, and available. If you want to produce software that you are going to sell out there, these days, most people are asking suppliers to provide their data protection impact assessments with the software. They call it security documentation or however, but at the end of the day, it's this sort of information that we are talking about. If you are going to document your security policies, these SSPs that we mentioned here, okay, your security policy or the paperwork that explains the security of your solution, you might want to consider that you want to have the version that is for you as an organization, where your software development team and your team understands all the bits and pieces of your design. And you might want to have a friendly version that you are happy to share with your clients or customers when they want to adopt your solution, or if you want to go for competition, a competition process, and you have to show that your software is secure enough. So you might have to think of two sets of documentation. Your internal one that has all the details that you can imagine and more, and that one that you are happy to share, okay? And you are happy to share and is explained in terms that the recipient can understand. Most of the people evaluating solutions at this level might or might not be experts in IT, and there are a number of data protection officers that they don't have an IT background. So you need to explain the security of your application in terms that either a technical person or not technical person can understand, okay? And finally, well, you complete your DPIA and you get your approval. And as I said, these are the people that you need to consider that are going to be working with you in preparing that DPIA and then approving it, okay? So the information asset owner, I explained that. It's not easy sometimes to identify who is your information asset owner. Because depends as well in what stage you are with your product. If you want to have someone that is responsible for your software as a product that you are going to sell, or if you are talking about an implementation, and then you need to identify who is responsible for the data that is used by your software, okay? So you want to identify these people, and depending on what moment of the development life cycle you are, might be a different individual, okay? You need to identify as well the senior information risk owner. That's the one that is going to pay the fines, remember, okay? It's liable for the fines at the end of the day as an organization in a corporate manner. The data protection officer, I think you heard of that, has to be qualified, okay? And is in some solutions, the organization that is responsible for the data, they have to be satisfied that the solution meets the requirements, okay? So if you are developing software to commercialize your software, probably you don't need to have a data protection officer in-house, but you want to be sure that a data protection officer that is sitting in your customer side is going to approve it, okay? So it's always a good idea to have someone that can understand what you have is good enough to be approved by a data protection officer or not. In healthcare, we also have something that is called Caldecott Guardians, and these guys are like the conscience of the organization from the ethical perspective. So if you want to sell your products there, they are going to be asked if they think that your software, the use that we are making from your software is ethical enough or not, okay? These are usually medical people, not IT people, but they look after the data from the patient's perspective, okay? Then you have a number of organizations that you work with in order to provide a solution. As I said, these are your subcontractors. You might have subcontractors. You might have other partner organizations if you are developing something in partnership, okay? So you need to have their views as well. And in the legislation, that's called data controllers and data processors. Data controllers make decisions. Data processors only follow instructions. But if you are going to enter into partnerships with others and you are going to make decisions together, you are jointly responsible for any consequences in terms of privacy as well. So you have to make these decisions together, be happy with the risk together, okay? If you are going to present something that is a project that is going to use your application for a national project, for example, this is very NHS, I have to say, okay? You have to go to panels that are set up in order to evaluate your proposition, how secure is your software, and so forth, and then approve it. In Scotland, we have something that is called PBPP, which is the Public Benefit and Privacy Panel, but there are other ones out there, okay, with the same principle. And rather than asking every single organization, every single NHS health board, and every single GP in the country, you go to present a solution to this panel, they approve it on behalf of the rest. And you have also to take into account that if your software is a medical device, then you also need approval from other type of organization, especially if you are going to commercialize that. You might need CE marking and so forth. So this is part of the security of your device, okay? And this is what I think it should include, okay? An overview, purpose, and functions of your system. You have to have clear in your DPIA the role of your organization and other partners or subcontractors. You want to have a clear picture in your risk assessment of who are you playing with in this game in terms of risk, okay? What are these organizations? You have to draw a sort of, or describe a personal data flow diagram. You have to describe the data that you are dealing with in terms of not just data items like name or identifiers or whatever, but also in terms of, I'm referring to this type of people. For example, my app, I'm developing an app to be used by, I don't know, have you read recently the news about the new NHS app? No? Well, it's an app to be used by teenagers, okay, and interact with the NHS. So when you describe your data, you have to say, well, we are talking about health data, basic demographics about the individual, and the individuals are citizens of the UK or Scotland or wherever, and they are teenagers. The focus is teenagers, or the focus is people with this or that disease or whatever is your collective, okay? So you have to describe your data in those terms. And we are talking about hundreds or thousands or two individuals that are going to use this app, okay? Or this software. You have to describe the functionality that you have in your application that is designed to cover the privacy rights that we mentioned before and how you are doing that. So you go right by right and you say how your application is adding functionality or coping in terms of control with each of these rights, privacy rights, okay? Then have you heard of the Google privacy statement or the Facebook privacy statement? Well, you have to do something similar for your application, okay? That's not mandatory, but it's helpful in order to sell your product later on, okay? So if you describe what is the privacy of by design, what is the privacy of your solution, it helps your customers to design or incorporate that into their privacy statement, okay? Public privacy statement. You need to have a risk register associated with your application. And you want to document in your privacy impact assessment the opinion of a qualified data protection officer, okay? As I said, you need to check if you need or not to do a DPIA following the ICO guidelines. But if you meet the criteria, then you want to have the opinion of a data protection officer. And obviously, it has to be signed off. So that's what it has. And this is in terms of the stages, regardless what approach or methodology you use for software development. Roughly, you will find in any of the approaches to software development, you will find in one way or another these stages. And this is the recommendation of how you trigger a DPIA, okay? So the requirements analysis, you have to identify there what are the privacy rights that are applicable here that we are talking about, what we're talking about. First draft at design, then in the development area is when you start deciding specific controls that you are going to apply, so you continue documenting that in your DPIA. In the testing area, you might decide in the testing area that either you need more controls or you might decide there that you have to accept some of the risks, okay? Implementation stage, you want to have implementation guidelines for those that need to use your application, and what is your recommendation and how should be used to be safe in terms of privacy, okay? And in terms of maintenance, you have to have a cycle where you review this DPIA anyway, okay? Technical measures, I'm not going to bother you too much about it, but I want to just bring, I mean, it's impossible to cover all the sort of controls that you can use in your software, okay? But you need to keep in mind that there are things that you can do in terms of pseudonymization, anonymization. Have you heard of those things, yeah? From the GDPR perspective, okay? Now, I only wanted to mention some of this because these are the most common ones that you are going to encounter: encryption, backups, access controls, data validation, and obviously as many others as you need to ensure that your solution is secure enough. But at the end of the day, there are lots of myths there, and you have to be clear what is a myth and what is actually a requirement. The requirement by law is that the security is secure enough, okay? And what is enough is something that we said is not written anywhere. A number of times I heard GDPR requires encryption, that your data, if you are using, if your application is processing personal data, has to be encrypted. The legislation doesn't say anywhere that has to be encrypted. What the legislation is telling you is that if you are using sensitive data, you must consider encryption. What encryption can do for you is give you peace of mind. And can you also somehow release you of some obligations? For example, if the data that your application is using is, your application is hacked, basically, for example, and it's stolen, if you have encryption, you don't have the need to notify all the data subjects that you had a breach, because the data was encrypted anyway. If it wasn't encrypted, you have to go through all the process that notify the breach to the Information Commissioner Office, notify the users, and so forth. So encryption is not mandatory, but can give you some room there to not to have to do a lot of things in case of a breach. And we have to be realistic here. It's very likely that software is going to be hacked. Solutions that we implement are going to be hacked. It's a matter of when, rather than security is these days so difficult, and the interdependencies are so big. So encryption is a high recommendation, but it's not mandatory. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, it depends on what do you understand that is more secure. For me, more secure is something that has more security measures, or is something that has less risk of something. If you take that more secure means you have a lesser risk for your privacy if the data is stolen or is disclosed as it shouldn't, I could say encryption definitely is more secure. But yeah. Yeah, encryption only gives you some protections in terms of privacy, and the assurances, to me, is in that case. If your data, for whatever reason, ends in the wrong hands, if they don't have the encryption key, they won't have access to the data. But that's not going to protect you from other things. Like, for example, if you don't have backups and you actually lose your data, and it's lost, that you cannot recover, encryption is not going to give you any solution there. So, yeah, encryption is good for some things, but it's not the ultimate solution.
Processing, presumably you've got a decrypted process, so it's going to be clear text at some point, the memory.
The other thing about encryption, I think, is you have to consider that where you want to put the responsibility of encryption on, and depending on how your piece of software is going to be introduced into an environment, you might think, well, my solution doesn't give itself encryption, but it's going to be in an encrypted environment. So you need to think of that as well, where you want to see that encryption, okay? But it's just, again, this is about thinking and being creative and understanding how your application is going to be used and make recommendations. So if, for example, you don't encrypt the data, your solution doesn't encrypt the data by design, you have to explain in the implementation guide that is a recommendation that an encryption solution is part of the future adoption of your software as part of the infrastructure or whatever, okay? The other thing is in terms of if you are thinking of, okay, I don't want to be worried about using personal data, therefore I'm going to anonymize it. Problem solved. Fine. However, if that's the route, you have to think that what the law says is that the data to be personal data is personal that is identifies an individual, or the individual can be identified with other data that is out there, and that by design, you think that can become identifiable later on by other people that are using your software or have other data that is linked to your solution. The way that information can become identifiable afterwards can be direct or can be indirect, so you have to take that into account. So it's no, these days I could say it's very difficult to know that data, or to say data is fully anonymized, because can very easily become non-anonymized after further linkage with more data that is available out there. So be mindful of what data are you using, about what people, and how other information about these individuals can be out there that, if linked somehow, can make your data identifiable afterwards. Okay, so big data is one of the things that you have to consider, the risk of re-identification and data mining as well. And the other thing that you can consider is pseudonymization. Pseudonymization is good, but from the Data Protection Act, it's still personal data, okay? But it's a good way to reduce the risk, so you have to consider when it's appropriate to remove some of the identifiers for a particular process, although later on, you know that is going to be, again, assigned to the original identifiers and becomes fully identifiable again. But that's by design. So you decide in what moments in your process, in your data flows, you can use pseudonymization to reduce the risk, okay? I'm not going to get too much into encryption. There are some guidelines there that you might want to check, okay? And I left the references if you want to go further in terms of the Information Commissioner Office recommendations for encryption, for example, are good to have in mind. The other thing, the other source that I think, if you don't know this one, have you used this resource before? Yes. Well, they have ideas for controls that you can apply, and they come up all the time with new things. So I think it's a good source to grab ideas. And they are always spotting what are the top 10 vulnerabilities that is advisable that you have into account as well in your code. So as a conclusions, I don't know if I want to do the conclusions. I just ask you, probably, what are you going to take from this in terms of your software development? You have the conclusions there. You know how to read, so you carry on later on. But what do you take from this in terms of your software development process? Well, Justin, you said at the beginning that we were going to do things differently today, yeah? So this is one of the things. How are you going to start, if you haven't done that, working differently to ensure that whatever you are doing in your development, you can start thinking of this early enough. Who are the people that you need to engage with in order to understand or get help with this data protection impact assessment? I don't think software developers are the ones that have to document the DPIA in themselves, but it's the team has to produce one. Okay? So how are you going to, what sort of documentation are you going to include if you are going to commercialize software in order to help your customers to make the decision that they want your product, because it's easier to understand what is the security that you have than others. Okay? So I think these are the things that, to me, you have to take with you today for software development, okay? The security measures that you are going to adopt depend on what is proportionate. Use the risk assessment, the impact assessment, to be reasonably comfortable with the security measures that you have adopted to a point that the risk is reasonable again, okay? And is proportionate. The security is proportionate to the risk, okay? I have to say that, as in the introductions, I work for the Scottish Government, but I'm also the chair of the BCS Health Scotland, or formerly called Health Informatics Scotland. And, well, we run a number of activities trying to, is at the end of the day, a multi-professional group, is for IT professionals. And if you want to join us, you are more than welcome. We need a lot of new people that want to make IT good for Scotland, we say, okay? And in another note, I've been told, okay, that NHS Lothian is looking for software developers, and this advert is out there. So if you are interested, it will be, I think, available in Show or in the Job Scot as well. So keep in mind that is for some software developers with medical devices in particular, okay, in the medical physics department. So I've been told, please pass that across. So here you are. And thank you very much. Okay, so. Well, if someone have a question in Basque or Spanish? Yep.
No, that is Spanish, but I'm
Yeah, of course.
So you mentioned that the people that the data you're gathering, like there is a data subject. So as a data subject, what can you do if there's a breach or something like identity theft happens? As a result of that, like what can you do? I guess to the organization,
Yeah.
anything you can do,
Yeah.
ask for information or anything.
Yes, you can. Yeah. There are various things that you can do. You can, I mean, if there is a data breach and you know that there is a data, depends how do you know there is a data breach. It has been the organization that has approached you and so forth, you know. But at the end of the day,
Clear example. So basically, someone went to the store and got a SIM card,
mm-hmm,
SIM card, pretending they were me, and basically, and the store gave it to them. I don't know what it was, but
mm-hmm,
that led to bank fraud. So it happened a month ago. But what would my recipe? Because basically, my telecom provider
mm-hmm,
didn't, like, in terms of data protection, didn't protect my data in any way.
mm-hmm.
And then that led to the bank kind of giving access to
Yeah.
my
Yeah, I mean, if you know who has, you might know, be able to identify who's the organization that has breached, okay? And in those cases, either you can report it to the Information Commissioner Office, or you can present a complaint to that organization using the internal process that they have for complaints. But you can escalate that if in terms of complaints it doesn't go anywhere, the internal process that they have. Once you have exhausted that route, you can go to the ICO and complain as well. But you can ask for compensation as well. So the complaint is one thing, and the compensation is another thing. When you report the breach to the ICO probably might or might not investigate. They should follow up what has happened, okay? And depends on the situation. They might issue a fine, okay? Or there are other resources. There are notifications that they can send as well. So not necessarily has to be a fine, but they can take action. But you also, if you can ask for compensation, but also you have to be prepared to defend what is the impact, the detrimental impact that has had in your privacy and so forth, okay? But yeah, of course you can. That's the purpose of having a law, and you have rights because you can do something about those rights. Otherwise, there won't be a purpose, yeah? Okay? Yep. Okay.
One of the slides, you talked about the DPIA process and how it fitted into the different stages of software development. And I was just wondering how the DPIA would be developed under like an agile development process.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times we don't really know a lot of the requirements.
Yep.
We're evolving over time and we don't know what the information assets we're going to be using. Just wondering how that...
Yeah. It's as I said, you cannot assume that you use the DPIA in an agile way, and you work with the document as something that is live and evolves all the time. As I said, that's not something static. That's actually one of the challenges that we have, is that people think that the DPIA is a document that you prepare at the end of your development, and just because the data protection officer asks you to do so. And that's not the way. The way is, as you understand better what you are doing with your solution, and you give shape to your solution, and you start thinking of the data, and you start thinking of controls that you are going to use, then you start put this information in your DPIA continually. That's the way. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh yes. Sorry. What is appropriate? No. That's the fun in this, you know, that there's no definition of what is appropriate. What I could say is that that's why you need to do a risk assessment. Even doing the DPIA is actually a risk assessment, okay? In essence, where you are asking people that collaborate in the design of your solution and the implementation of your solution about what is their appetite to accept that what you are doing is appropriate or not. It doesn't mean that if something goes wrong and goes to the Information Commissioner office, they are going to have the same opinion than the ones that prepared the DPIA. Okay, they might say what you thought was appropriate is definitely very inappropriate. Okay, it can happen. Of course, can happen. That's why you need to have involvement of these other roles that we mentioned. You need to have someone like a data protection officer. It's not that you must, but it's a recommendation that you have a data protection officer involved that can tell you, yeah, the level of risk here that your organization is prepared to accept is okay. Or they might say it's too high and you have to work harder, or the recommendation is that you mitigate this or that, or, you know. The suggestion is that in the privacy impact assessment, as I said, you work in terms of the privacy rights, okay? So you focus your attention in the privacy rights. How are you protecting the access, the right to access, the a right to eraser. So if you are developing an application that there's no way that if someone wants the right to be forgotten that you mentioned, if someone wants their data to be deleted, and I'm not saying that just because it's asking for that, you have to do it, okay? All I'm saying is, if in that particular case it's pertinent, and a data protection officer should tell you if it's pertinent or not. But if it's pertinent, how your solution is going to facilitate, through functionality or something, the implementation of that right, okay? Accessibility is one of the things. Data portability is the other one. Eraser, objection. There is something about retention of the data. So if your software cannot accommodate that at the end of a period of time that is considered the end of the life cycle of the data, your data has to be deleted because there's no further reason to keep it. If your application doesn't help with that, to automate that, then it's an issue. And that's a serious issue in a number of software applications that we are using these days. You don't have a good system to manage dynamic and varied retention periods depending on the type of information that your application is handling, okay? So it's not just a fix. After 3 years, I delete everything. No, that's not what we are talking about. We are talking about that you can set up a retention policy by functionality in your application that kicks off the deletion of data as some triggers deletion of data or removal of data when it's time to do so in a dynamic way and diverse, accommodating various rules, if you like. So all these rights, you need to know what are you doing in your application to ensure that these rights can be exerted. Okay? Yeah? Okay, well, good luck. And if you find the way to do these things in a very, very efficient way, let me know.